they began to consider rebellion.
The German settlers want more and more land. They want land, they want it cheaply, and they want it now. And the German soldiers see themselves as the future settlers. They want to become settlers once they've finished their military service. And you have a situation where the German settlers and the German soldiers find one another in the desire for land. And they are opposed in this by Theodor Leutwein, the governor, and by the Herero.
By Christmas 1903, the capital Windhoek was alive with rumors. In the bars, settlers and their allies in the army openly called for a war against the Herero. Governor Leutwein was now the only force in the colony preventing war. But at the exact moment when his cool head was most needed, a minor revolt in the south meant that he and most of the garrison left. The results were disastrous. Within weeks of the governor's departure, the extremists in the army finally pushed the Herero too far. They rose up, and terrible scores were settled as the relatives of Herero, raped or killed by Germans, took their revenge. In the first few days, over 100 German soldiers and farmers were killed. But the rebellion provided the perfect pretext for the most radical among the settlers and the army to take over the land. They now set about the grim work of ethnically cleansing the colony of the Herero. But there was a problem. Not all the Herero had rebelled. In fact, the rebellion of January 1904 was relatively localized at first, centering around the northern town of Okahanja. Elsewhere, the Herero were just going about their normal lives. To achieve their aim of taking the land, the settlers and the army had to drag the whole Herero nation into the rebellion and transform it into a race war. The story of what happened in the tiny Herero town of Otjimbingwe shows how, once the war had started, it spread to engulf the whole of the Herero people. Today, Otjimbingwe is a forgotten backwater, but in 1904 it was an important Herero center. The Hereros of Otjimbingwe had close links with the community of German settlers with whom they shared the town. 3 days before the outbreak of fighting in the north, the German settlers here gathered to celebrate a wedding. But that evening, a messenger arrived bringing news that the Herero at Okahanja were on the brink of rebellion. Rather than panic, the missionaries of Otjimbingwe instead met with the Herero chief Zacharias, who declared his peaceful intentions. He even wrote a letter to Governor Leutwein, declaring his loyalty to Germany. But the next evening, a group of German soldiers arrived in the town with food and ammunition. During the following days, the white population from the whole area began to abandon their farms and gather in Otjimbingwe. And with each new arrival came a new story of the death and destruction that was sweeping across the colony. As their fears increased, the white population began to fortify a complex of farm buildings belonging to the Halbich family. The Herero, meanwhile, held their normal Sunday service. As their hymns rang out across the town, the German soldiers, only meters away, paced out the range of their field of fire. Barbed wire was strung around the building, and firing holes made in the walls of the Halbich station. On the 23rd of January, just 9 days after the start of the uprising at Okahanja, the German troops finally opened fire. Despite all their demonstrations of loyalty, the Herero of Otjimbingwe was swept into a war they didn't want, against a German community amongst whom they had lived peacefully for years. What was happening in Ochimbingwe was being repeated across the country. What had started as a rebellion was becoming a war. A month after the start of the conflict, Governor Leutwein finally returned to the capital. To end the fighting, he sent a message to the Herero chief Samuel Maherero to begin negotiations. But once the settlers learnt that Leutwein had started negotiations, this fact was immediately leaked to their supporters in Berlin. Back in Germany, right-wing politicians and the pro-imperialist organizations wanted to use the Herero uprising as a pretext to take over the colony completely.
When the Herero uprising breaks out, news of it reaches Berlin on the 14th of January 1904. There is a huge pressure from the Pan-German League, from various other interest groups, attacking the governor, Leutwein, for his soft policy towards the inhabitants of Southwest Africa. And they are putting pressure as much as they can through articles, pamphlets, this kind of thing, propaganda, on public opinion and indirectly, therefore, on the government to take a tougher line.
To the right-wing press, the Herero were not a people with whom Germany should negotiate, but savages who should be crushed.
The German media constructs this image of a savage enemy, this barbaric enemy that kills anybody and rapes white women and kills children. And there's a whole campaign in Germany, a propaganda campaign, to construct this enemy that doesn't really exist.
A heady mix of nationalism, militarism and racism swept over the Second Reich. Kaiser Wilhelm II ordered a new army to be sent to crush the rebellious Herero. And to lead this force, he appointed a commander with a fearsome reputation, General Lothar von Trotter. Six months after the start of the rebellion, von Trotter landed in Southwest Africa. He immediately met with Governor Leutwein and formally took over command. But at their meeting, Leutwein again appealed for negotiations to be resumed with the Herero. And this would have been the normal strategy in a colonial war. But the hysteria in Berlin meant that this no longer was a colonial war.
Von Trotter is not there to negotiate. For von Trotter, negotiation is a sign of weakness. For von Trotter, negotiation would be a shame to German honor, to German militarism. There is only one solution, the destruction of the Herero. Unfortunately for the Herero, they did not see that the rules of the game, as it were, had changed.
Yet the rebellion that von Trotter had come to crush was essentially over. After the initial outburst of violence, the Herero had changed their tactics. After twice fighting the German garrison to a stalemate, the Herero had started to avoid all contact with the Germans. The entire people had instead moved as far away from the German settlements as they could get. They gathered at the last big waterhole before the Kalahari Desert, the great plateau of Waterberg, Water Mountain. There they waited, hoping for negotiations, but they never came.
I think the Hereros would have considered the war over by spring 1904, because the way wars were usually fought in Namibia was there was battles and then that was it. It was over, you settle it and you negotiate terms and that's the end of that. The Hereros had proved their point, don't take all our land, treat us as humans and we'll let that be that. Because they were at the point where they could have attacked Windhoek and the main stations, but decided not to. They backed off, they proved their point. So I think from the Herero point of view, they were very clear on what had happened. Now the German side of the issue is completely different.
What the Herero at the Waterberg could not possibly have known was that instead of planning negotiations, the Germans were assembling a colonial army unlike any other. Week after week in the late summer of 1904, hundreds of soldiers were sent from Germany, along with huge supplies of the latest weapons and artillery. One of the